Hi, and welcome to another edition of Only in Illinois, your weekly video recap from Reboot Illinois. I'm Madeline Dubeck here with Matt Dietrich, and we're about 1 month away from the time when the legislators in Springfield should have a budget passed for the fiscal year that begins July 1st. And this week, lots of people started scrambling and making every effort they can to save the money they expect. And one of those groups were mayors from all over the state of Illinois. Explain for us a little bit about what they're so upset about, Matt, and what they're doing to try to preserve their funding.
When Governor Bruce Rauner put out his budget proposal back in February, one of the things he proposed was to cut in half the amount of state tax revenue that goes back to smaller governments, municipal governments. When the governor was also faced with closing an immediate budget gap of $1.6 billion just to finish out the current fiscal year. And his budget director initially had wanted to cut the amount that the cities would receive right now in the current fiscal year. Well, they raised a big stink about that, so the administration backed off, continued their full allotment, but then they turned around on Good Friday and they made $26 million in human services cuts, which proved to be extremely unpopular, and we've talked about that before. That's when the Autism Project and epilepsy treatment and other things like that lost their funding. And what that showed was, when they don't cut here, they're going to have to cut there. And to you as a citizen of Illinois, but also as a resident of any city, you're not really so concerned about, you're going to be paying either way. Now,
it's just which pocket it's coming out of.
Right, which brings us to this week. And this week the mayors had a couple of press conferences, one in the suburbs and one in Springfield, to make their case again, and this time for the 2016 budget, when they would lose half of their funding for an entire year.
We're the ones that have come out of this recession making the necessary cuts, and again, you'll see statewide on an average of about 10 to 15% reductions have been made in staffs by local governments. And we came out of that, and we continue to balance our budgets. And I'll guarantee you, a loss of 50% revenue to cities and villages in this state, you think the state has problems. Why are you going to turn around and create absolute chaos and turn governments upside down at the local level with that type of loss of revenue? It's unacceptable, and as our position has been, it's not just a matter of the 50%, 0%. That is our line we're drawing in the stand.
In the state budget, but at the end of the day, don't sink the local government ship just to keep the state afloat.
Lastly, the governor made a comment in his remarks that the cities have so much money in reserves. Belleville currently has about $3.2 million in reserves, which is what our auditors tell us we need to have at a minimum, and we have to have that if we want to maintain a bond rating, if we ever want to do any work or improvements in our city.
Now, you wrote about one of the more interesting aspects of the budget in this week's on Reboot Illinois, and this has always been something that's fascinated me as a watcher of budget negotiations. It seems like every year there's a budget crisis in Illinois, for as long as I can remember. And from time to time, you'll get to the end of May and all of a sudden they announce, well, we're just going to sweep special funds and make up our deficit that way. We're just going to go in there to this, it seems like a magic money place, where they're keeping all this money and we're just going to sweep it because it's just sitting there waiting to be used. We're going to take it out of these special funds. Now, you wrote about those special funds. How many are there and how much money are
So I checked in with the comptroller, who is the keeper of the state's checkbook, and got a quite long spreadsheet back that showed that there were nearly 800 different special funds in the state of Illinois. So many that your eyes literally roll back into your head when you're looking at them. You can't even begin to some of them are acronyms you can't even make heads or tails out of.
Then you also have that there is a salmon special fund and a fish and wildlife special fund.
And as Comptroller Leslie Munger pointed out, isn't a salmon a fish? There's also a pheasant fund.
Okay.
I'm sure that's a very important fund, but why, I can't tell you.
And those funds are holding how much?
I don't, I'd have to have a cheat sheet here to tell you exactly how much but altogether, the nearly 800 funds
Right,
in
that's what I-
total, yes, $9.67 billion.
Right, now, that's the number
That's a key number.
that I seized on, because you're talking over $9 billion that are sitting in these funds, just sitting there waiting. And yet, there is great turmoil over having to cut $6.2 billion. Well, simple. Just take it out, fill in the hole, and you're good to go, right? Why not?
Well, not so simple, Matt, because a lot of that money is federal money. We get a certain amount of matching money from the federal government for certain activities like taking care of health care for poor people and other things like that. And so there are restrictions on how that money can be spent. So you can't just grab it and use it for something else. A lot of these funds were created, we've all heard about the check off on your income tax form for a certain special cause. Breast cancer or domestic violence are a couple that come to mind. When those funds are created, they're very specifically created a lot of times with protection on them that they can only be spent for certain activities in a certain way. So I'm assuming that a lot of these funds have that protection on them. On the other hand, the governor's office, in agreement with the Democratic heads of the House and the Senate, just swept $1.3 billion from them. So there's clearly some wiggle room there. And the other bigger issue, I think, is that that's a whole lot of money that we never hear about. We don't ever see. It's become a shadow budget that lacks transparency and accountability.
Right, and as you said, when we really, really hit crisis level just this year, just last month, well, we went in and found $1.3 billion. And it's very mysterious to the general public. It's hard for all but the budget experts to understand. And it's an area that a lot of reformers have said that needs to be changed. There needs to be some transparency to it. You need to figure out why is there such a large amount that has to sit untouched in these funds.
And there are government experts who have suggested that some of these funds be consolidated or at least included in the budget that we all hear about every year, because we're only really hearing about a small portion of the state budgeting and spending that actually goes on every year.
And I think this kind of illustrates the complexity of the whole process. It's very hard to understand, it's hard to follow, and here we are, a month away from when they have to draft this immensely complicated document, and we really still don't know anything other than what Governor Rauner has put out there that says we're going to cut our way out, we're going to cut $6.2 billion. Essentially, we're going to cut 20% of what what's the budget. So we're heading toward, I think, another one of these scenarios where everything gets compressed into that last week, that last few days, and everything happens so quickly that for the next 6 months, we're left trying to figure out the fallout.
Well, and you'd have to be brilliant and a speed reader to figure out what's going to be in this budget when it actually gets presented to the General Assembly and voted on. Most rank and file lawmakers probably will not have read that budget, the final version of it, from beginning to end, and they'll be asked to vote on it. And that's not changing the way we do things in Illinois,
Right.
which is something that Bruce Rauner campaigned on. Now it's a big task to ask him to change that his first go-round here, but it's very difficult to have much accountability or transparency when even the people voting don't have much chance to review what they're voting on.
Okay, well, we saw a few weeks ago what happened when $26 million got cut from some popular and high-profile programs. And so we're going to see a lot bigger cuts coming around, we think, because no one's talked about bringing new tax revenue
Not
yet.
yet, no.
So,
I mean, there are tax revenue bills, but we haven't heard much from the governor or the
right.
key lawmakers.
So at this point, we're waiting and watching,
And it will be pain for everyone.
including the mayors and including you, because you live in both a city and you also live in the
Right.
state of Illinois.
Watch your wallet. That's it for this week's edition of Only in Illinois. Thanks for tuning in. We'll see you next week.